I'm fussy about my hair because I'm on like YouTube now, so I like want to have nice hair. And these like big goofy editing headphones that I have, they give me like a mushroom head. So that's our little moment of vanity before we say welcome back, Fadil. It's good to see you. 2 years. I can't believe it's been 2 years since you've been on the show. Where does the time go, as the cliche goes? Tell us for anybody who didn't listen to the episode, they should go back and listen to it. It's almost 2 years to this day. It's called Tunisia's Unfinished Revolution. Question mark? Question mark? It was a great episode, and we're kind of here, I think, to continue that conversation and kind of get an update on what's going on. But first, for people who don't know you, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work and your
Sure, yeah.
interests?
My name is Fadil Aliriza. I'm a journalist. I founded the English and Arabic news outlet Meshkal in 2019, but I've been covering Tunisia as a journalist for basically since 2011, doing sort of political analysis as well and doing some research here and there about mostly like politics and political economy, but various issues that are going on. I'm just trying to sort of figure out what's been happening.
Great. We kind of been talking about this for a few months now, sort of coming back together and sort of updating the situation because I mean, if you listen to that last episode that we did, and it's like kind of says it in the title, like what is this thing called the Tunisian Revolution? Like you heard so much about it 10 years ago, 12 years ago now in the so-called Arab Spring, which I don't like that term. And it's like, I'd rather think in that case, I'd rather not do these kind of like large arcs of like, I don't know, whatever, who cares? Who cares about periodization? I'm not an academic anymore. So, but like, it's in the sense that like this branded event, at least in the news sphere that we lived in called the Arab Spring, Tunisia played such a starring role, or and since, and I can't help but say that like it does occupy like a pretty like big blind spot, at least for me personally. It's not true for everyone, but we were saying this off mic, and it has to do a little bit with, I mean, obviously as somebody like watches the regions and stuff, talks about this stuff, it's like it falls to you to like go after this stuff. However, there's also we were talking about like living in the Anglosphere and how like it seems to be that there's more of a kind of francophone, kind of foreign interest in the country, and it's more sort of centered in the French speaking world, and that probably has things to do with the history of 19th century colonialism, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, we're here to sort of learn. I was thinking that, we should catch up on what's been happening in the last 2 years, but also for people who don't know, can you give us a kind of like the kind of like newsman summary of 2000 and like the sort of supposed sea change in Tunisia with the Arab Spring, and kind of lead us up to the stalemate of 2 years ago, well, of now, and like kind of draw that out for a little bit, because people will have heard about it, but it may not have.
Yeah, I mean, like starting from 2011, right? Yeah. So that was, I mean, what some people call a revolution. I mean, you say like the Arab Spring. I mean, a lot of people I think don't call it the Arab Spring in Tunisia. There's even sort of this term like the Jasmine Revolution, which again is not really like used in Tunisia. There's a few people who use it, but like for the most part, it's not really referred to as that. And there's actually quite a lot of skepticism since 2011 about actually whether what happened was a revolution. That there actually wasn't sort of the gains that people expected from it. People rose up in what was sort of an uprising that started really from the south of the country, like these interior regions that have long felt that they are neglected because there isn't sort of investment from the state. There isn't public investment. The public infrastructure is falling apart. In many ways, this is sort of like has a long history to it, but and there's also a long history of uprisings starting from the center of the country. But it spread. I mean, it spread, all the way to the capital to a point where, the president Ben Ali fled because he no longer was in control. I mean, there was sort of a breaking of the wall of fear. It was, media played a really important role here in terms of sort of the images being sort of fed back to people in the capital of what was going on in the countryside. And then sort of, that sort of opened up a lot of possibilities, and the possibilities were, okay, where does this go? What has since happened since 2011 is as sort of one way of looking at it has been to call it a democratic transition. That's kind of like the overriding like master narrative of what's been going on in Tunisia since 2011. And actually, like the current president, his sort of like one of his like supposed ideological influences is this guy Rida Lenin Mekki, who like has a very like long sort of exegesis on what the democratic transition is, and basically saying democratic transition was not the same thing as like a national project, right? Like, or it's not like enough of a national project for people to like unify around. But what you had was like elections, then you had a writing of a new constitution. Those weren't really what people had sort of been protesting about in 2011. They hadn't been saying like we want a new constitution. They'd been saying like we want dignity, work, freedom, right? And there was a lack of all of these under the Ben Ali led or managed regime, and suddenly there is certainly a lot more freedom that we have seen after 2011. But then you also see basically one government after another kind of incapable of addressing people's basic needs while you see the economy tanking, really. So there, I mean,
sounds like democracy to me. sounds like the kind of democracy I know. Very familiar. Congratulations, Tunisians! You're part of the liberal democracy now.
Yeah,
you break it, you bought it.
Well, there you go. It's like it is like yeah. It was in so many ways it was the liberal democratic model. In a way that like for years, Tunisia had been called sort of this like good student of the IMF and the World Bank in terms of economic liberalization. And then people sort of noticed that after 2011, especially after 2014, when a new constitution was passed, Tunisia became this sort of like darling of like a good student of democracy. And really this is sort of what like fed into this narrative, I think, especially in the West, of Tunisia having being this sort of exceptional case. So when you mentioned the Arab Spring, it's like, okay, the Arab Spring, all of them have issues. All of these countries have issues after these uprisings, except, Tunisia is the one sort of shining example of liberal democracy. And like, there's certainly a lot of factors by which you could say like, and I think in our like last episode, we talked about how actually like a lot of the factors that are positive in Tunisia like have positive factors from before, whether that's like a fairly good institutional like union that can play in some ways like a counteracting role to power, the top-down power, or in terms of like other sort of institutions from like lawyers association, judges association, being able to like play a role in society in a way that like maybe you didn't see other institutions playing roles in other countries, or that even just like state capacity. I mean, like, there's sort of organs of the state that like were, despite like liberalization, despite sort of privatization, you saw maintaining some capacity. So all of those sort of factors like played into like the fact that like there wasn't sort of the violence that we saw post 2011 in Tunisia as we saw in some of the other countries where there were uprisings. But I think a lot of the sort of problems that I mentioned like briefly built up to the point where people were really fed up about it, and sort of brings us to the moment almost 2 years ago, July 25th, 2021, when President Kais Saied basically says, I'm suspending parliament, I'm getting rid of the prime minister, I'm assuming greater powers. What he said was sort of, it was indicated at the time was sort of temporary, but when he made this decision, people went crazy. I mean, people went out into the streets. And I think people who aren't in Tunis don't really understand like the energy that was there that night, because I mean, really what had happened before in many ways felt repressive. Like it felt oppressive and repressive, like not just sort of like the particular government just before Kais Saied dismissed them, but sort of it had been building up in terms of like, this is not a system that in any way listens to people and people's needs, or responds to people's needs in any sort of like tangible way.
Yeah, well, yeah. This is so. Then the question then is, like, and this is the like, this is the $64,000 question. Like, if like things like, there's this thing called the state in our lives, and like like capital S, and it plays this big, powerful, like all encompassing. Depends on where you are, obviously, to the degree, but it is the sort of main interaction, sort of guarantor of like our social interactions, from the most banal things like getting a driver's license. I guess that's not that banal. There's more things, but like to the circulation of our food, our resources, running water, stuff like that. Like these are all things that we looked for to like the state. Like it's not, it's not, and you wonder about like what it means then to like overthrow a state, because like that's an incredibly violent act, right? Because if a state is like if the state is a state, then it has this internal like immunity response to any attacks upon it, and that's like true for any country, and like the nature of that response is going to be specific to that case. But the state is this kind of organism that has a defense inside of it, like a system of defense. So then you have to ask yourself, like, how do things unfold in countries with revolutions, right? Like something has to go terribly wrong inside of that state to allow for it to fall, right? Like we have this very juvenile view over here that if enough people meet on a Saturday afternoon at a public place and they march towards some other public place, disconnected and chanting things in small groups, that if you rinse, wash, and repeat over and over again will get you somewhere. Now, with that being said, when you combine protest movements with like things like strikes, like that's a different story. But strikes is a category of labor action that like is not necessarily revolutionary. Most strikes take place in a you could say almost not counter-revolutionary, but in the sense that like, oh, we want to improve our conditions of our lives, of our work relationship. So it's like not it's not aimed at anything. It's aimed at sort of like internal, like making the life of your own, like making your own life inside of whatever state you're in better, right? This is a long preamble, but I'm trying to say that like the fact that Tunisia's revolution occurred and is this more of a reflection of the lack of the like the illegitimacy? I mean, we talked about this last time too. Is it more of a reflection of the illegitimacy of the previous government, or was it some kind of like a mixture of cosmetic change, which then masks the fact that certain classes and certain elites rule countries? Like they form a kind of ruling elite, and that's specific to each country, obviously. But it seems to me that in the Tunisian case, the power still is retained inside of like the ancien regime, whatever you want to call it. Like whoever fell, the system of Tunisia is still there, even if it has, made some pretty radical changes, or even some failed. But like, is that a kind of correct assessment with Tunisia, or has there been more than cosmetic change? Because like, how is there not violence? Like, how do you not have violence if it's like what was the point of the previous state then? You know what I mean? Like, what did it do for anyone if like nobody had stakes enough to defend it?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like the French, I think it was Interior Minister at the time of like the protests was like offering to send like security forces to support Ben Ali. Like, I mean, it was like quite infamous. Like the people were like, it was shocking. Like it was really shocking that like this French Interior Minister didn't understand like the political temperature at that moment. That was like we're way past that, and also like this is extremely sort of just explicit sort of like what would you see in like a colonial times. But like, yeah, I mean, certainly like the Ben Ali like managed regime, because I don't think the regime is just Ben Ali. Like there's a whole architecture of like what was sort of like governing Tunisia under during that time, including like not least like you have to include like foreign lending, foreign training, like sort of I mean, Tunisia is a small country. It's not a country that manages to like preserve its sovereignty easily without, trying to balance different, sort of opposing interventionist forces in a way that like, maybe you'll be able to carve out some sort of like independence, governing independence. But, the moment in 2011, like I think it's like, we revisited it a little bit before, but like, you can revisit it over and over again, because like, what was it that like, caused this particular moment? There's certainly a class aspect of it. I mean, there was one element was that like Ben Ali and his family were in some ways sort of representing like a nouveau riche that was like encroaching on like old aristocracy. So that like even the old aristocracy was getting like kind of upset at like, they can tolerate this guy for to a degree, but like, if you have like his family members coming in like bullying people off of like key elements of the economy, like then that also becomes a problem even for the aristocracy. So you did have sort of like obviously like a bottom up start to the revolution, but then you also saw even like middle classes, upper classes like joining in. And I think sort of like the element is also like you have to from a class perspective, you also have to see that like eventually people just get sort of fed up with their economic situation if there's consistently 20% unemployment or close to 20% unemployment, because we know that the sort of the numbers before were sort of like massaged. I mean, this is sort of, yes, you see this problem like across the global south of like this like labor reserve pool that's there to sort of drive down prices because labor is so cheap. But at a certain point, like you can only take that for so long, and at the same time, you saw that there's certainly like parts of the Tunisian state that have been serving and had been serving like important social roles and important like public roles. But there's also this element of like the bureaucracy just being completely maddening. Like I had a family member recently who like received an email saying and like, congratulations, your request for this administrative procedure has been accepted and is scheduled for 2017. And this is an email like just arrived in 2023. Like they're like, oh, this is really great news that like 6 years later you have an email talking about like something in the past as if it's in the future. But like, I mean, that's just sort of like a very, very small example of like, I mean, like the just sort of like the bureaucracy really grinds people down, particularly like as you get to the poor like the spectrum of society. Like it's just and we're seeing this now like with like sort of like migrants. I mean, there are migrants from other African countries who like the administrative capacity of the state is like just grinding them down because they just can't get residence permits, and that leads to not being able to hold down jobs, to have rental agreements, and this is maybe just the most vulnerable sector of people in Tunisia, but like even very poor Tunisians like feel this sort of like the just the crushing power of the state when it comes to that. At the same time, there's like there's elements of the state that are absolutely crucial, right? I mean, public healthcare. People want more investment in this. Like, they want an expansion of the state when it comes to like healthcare, education. I mean, like, people are absolutely desperate for it. It's just like, how do people find a way to power to sort of say like, we want the tools of the state working for us and not against us.
Yeah, I mean that's the $64,000 question. I guess that's like the second one. That's the $128,000 question, because what is power in our lives? Like, how does the powers, how does it manifest? Like, how does it relate to us? How does it like how do we interact with that thing called the state? And that seems to be like, in so many different sort of like national contexts, that seems to be a sort of primary motivator for a lot of different revolutions. I mean, maybe that's too much of like you can't really summarize, because like, yeah, it's such an interesting thing to think about in terms of like, the backbone of a state is like it's like no state is run by its people, right? Like, there's no such thing as democracy. Let's all grow up. Like, there's voting. Okay. Like, you can have voting, you can have political parties, you can have like, politicians who change seats. But like, the idea that that's something called democracy, like, is just such a like hilarious joke, like here too, just as much as in Tunisia or anywhere else. Like, it's like countries are run by a class of people, by like a class of like a broad class too. And if you can incorporate a wide spectrum of people into the running of that country, there's a better chance that your country will run longer, right? And I guess the other question is like, who's gunning for your country too? Because we live in like this jungle world where you have these like fierce predators who prey on like small countries like Tunisia, actually, for whatever resources they have, because that's just monopoly capital. That's how it works. It's like this rapacious violent machine. Like, it just won't stop eating. So like, how do you, like, as you said that, like a small country, like how do you negotiate your sovereignty? Especially when you have like insane wars that went around like all around your neighbors. I mean, we talked about this in other episodes, but Algeria suffered an insanely violent war. Libya, as we know, is still undergoing war. Um, like it's not Egypt too. You could say multiple wars in terms of before the 80s, obviously, but the level of violence throughout this entire process of like toppling a state. So then my question is like, and I guess I just return to the first question, like what the actual like where are the roadblocks happening to revolutionary change, like if we can really call it that? Because like to me, I mean, we're talking about social reform. This is like a reform battle. This is like a restructuring of like economic relations of individuals to the state. This is not like a state like you know what I mean? Like it just feels like musical
Yeah.
chairs. Or is that like too cynical?
I
Which is also like here, this is exactly here. We have musical chairs here. That's like, it just changes based on circumstances and like the ruling elite fight, but ultimately it's the same party
Yeah,
goers.
I mean, I try and separate between I, I think it's helpful to me to try and separate between like the state versus like the regime and the government, which all these terms get confused anyways because like they mean something different in like like the French system versus like the English system. But like Tunisia, like the state itself, I don't think has been like it hasn't been the victim of like rapid destruction in the way that we've seen like I don't know, somewhere like Iraq, maybe like you've seen like rapid destruction. You've seen it like over time. Like it's been very much like through these like economic mechanisms of like privatization, liberalization that's like happened slowly with actually quite a lot of like resistance from within like the state mechanisms themselves, right? Like there are like bureaucrats, civil servants who, very quietly operate in ways that I think are sort of like pushing back against attempts to dismantle that. And there's a very like explicit attempt to dismantle it in sort of like the IMF loan and its conditions, which are they come also with EU conditions with sort of macro financial assistance, has been very much about recrafting the Tunisian state in this very neoliberal sort of vision of the state, not getting involved in certain parts of the economy, saying, it no longer has the capacity to do sort of like public investment, public hiring, all to like the detriment of like, like the Tunisian people when it comes to like, if the Tunisian state can't hire young doctors, if it can't hire, young teachers, these people actually just go off and brain drain to Europe. I mean, like, Germany like actively recruits, and France is very happy to receive these people who are trained at the cost of the Tunisian state, for many years, and then they end up benefiting from this like human capital. So there's like a human capital drainage, which is certainly like, I would say like you could classify this as a slow motion attack on the state. But that doesn't mean that there isn't resistance to it. And like that resistance, I would say wasn't coming from parliament. I mean, like one thing that we saw like in the sort of like parliamentary system, like a lot of people point to the parliamentary system from 2011 onwards as, one of the issues was there was a lot of fragmentation, there was a lot of like horse trading, you had sort of this elite consensus between the Islamists and the quote unquote anti-Islamists. That this was sort of like leading to like political gridlock. Like the one thing where like they agreed is on sort of like political liberalization, right? Like it's just like let's like let things go on automatic. Whatever it is that the World Bank recommends, the EU recommends, the IMF recommends on economic reforms. We'll go ahead with that. Not necessarily accepted by the unions, not necessarily accepted by, civil servants within ministries, right? Like there's definitely like, a sort of resistance to that project within the Tunisian state. And this is part of, I think, the issue that we saw with like, why in some ways Parliament was seen as very unpopular is there wasn't sort of like consensus on the things that maybe were important to a lot of Tunisians. And then I want to like pick up on what you said about like democracy, like this sort of like this frustration of democracy, like that frustration with democracy is like, or like, what does democracy mean? Is there an alternative to sort of this, like, just like, is it on or off, like this voting, like you go, you vote, and then, what happens? Nothing really happens. You kind of are just sort of like keeping the system going, but like, you're not seeing like tangible benefits. Like there's like a very sort of like a cartoonish understanding of democracy by like some people within like, I don't know, like, let's say like U.S. poli-sci adjacent, or maybe some like regional studies that like, you're on or off, you turn it on like a switch. But there's certainly like frustration with like the liberal democratic model and the parliamentary system, and in particular like this like very weird like division between executive of like the prime minister versus the president, which was leading to all kinds of issues in Tunisia, until Kais Saied just sort of like intervened and said like, no, things are going my way instead. But like, and so the president has been sort of saying like, oh, well, I want to have sort of this alternative vision of democracy, like real democracy. We're going to revive the revolution. The revolution went off its path, and we need to put it back on its path. And so democracy could mean something like council democracy. Like you're going to have like, councils that are going to be like sort of like the grassroots developers of policy. And he's sort of like, there's some element of like councilism. There's some element of like, people have pointed to maybe like Gaddafi as a model. There hasn't been like talk of like, Soviets and the Soviet system, or like, like worker councils necessarily. The issue is like in Tunisia, there isn't any sort of like, there isn't sort of a grassroots decentralized system. Like it's almost like the president is trying to do like a top-down imposition of like a decentralized council democracy, but he doesn't. I mean, it's not really clear, right? Like there's a little bit of like ideological like vagueness to it that like lends itself to like not having actual participation by people. Like people are not like necessarily interested in reshaping the contours of the Tunisian state. They're like, okay, can
most people don't care. Like they don't, like they don't have a vision of politics that is administrative. Like they don't have like a theory of a political freedom. Like they don't give a shit. Like it's I mean, this is where the individual sort of and this is a global thing. Like modernity is very, very profoundly individuated. And this is not just like a Western thing. This is like over the course of the world, like individuality and like individual, whatever, nuclear family, however you want to call it, like that bourgeois family, like took pretty precedence in our lives. So it makes sense that people like is the closest thing they see. I guess the question is Tunisia's population being what it is, like 12 million or something, like, and the nature of like Tunisian geography and like where those places are, like, because I feel that so much of our ideas about revolution are so urban, that they're so like urban based, and we fetishize them. Oh, Tahrir Square, like there's this like fetishization of cities, and I can't help but shake that like that's just like it's like a weird like masked like Franco-Europhilia for like what's his name? Who's the painter? The famous French romanticist painter, like I can't remember his name. I've purged all this stuff. Delacroix. Like people have this sort of like Delacroixian image of revolution and people, and it's like very romantic, and people are waving flags, and it's all like, whereas like like revolutions, a lot of revolutions have been led by peasants. A lot of more global revolutions that stuck it out would have been led by peasants and also not urban people. So I guess my question is like, do the image, at least the primary image of the Tunisian revolution that I have, at least from my Western lens, and that just totally 100% just could be me and my sources, seems to be an urban middle class one. Like, I don't know if that's true. Maybe that just could be like the face of it to me, but it seems to me that like the kinds of urban and at least from what I know in other country cases, the revolutions that urban middle class like liberal people support are not the ones that say rural working class or like peasants or farmers or industrialists or like whatever, like workers, industrial workers may support. And I think that's true here. That's also true here, that there is a class divide, that like people who live in like the sticks outside of the big cities in Canada. Now, mind you, there's not that many of them. The vast majority of the country lives in a very, very shallow. So Canada's kind of weird comparison, but it's probably more true of the US. I don't know. But I guess my fear is that like the like is it do you think it's a fair assessment to say that it was like middle class, or was it something sort of like across the class spectrum?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like the timeline of the revolution is so important because it started in Sidi Bouzid, which like is very much an agricultural, like they're rich, like they're rich in agricultural resources. Like this is like the main thing that this region produces. And the person who started it, Mohammed Bouazizi, like, there's sort of like a little bit of work like documenting how his family had been dispossessed, right? And from the land. And, the second place to rise up was in Gasrin. And like, these are the two places where like the most people killed in the early days of the revolution, like per capita, were these two places. And Gasrin is also an agricultural region. Like these are sort of, this is what the wealth of Tunisia is in many ways like agricultural. And they both cut like regions that feel like we have been exploited when the French came in, and we've been continued to be like exploited and like colonized by like internally since then. And yes, I think like when the revolution like spreads to the cities and Tunis, I think I might have mentioned this last time that like a lot of the poor slums in Tunis where it first started were like these are people who were dispossessed from rural areas, like maybe one generation back, two generations back, but these slums are the legacy of urbanization that's like happened in a very like in a very destructive way, like in a destructive way, like for the countryside, but also in the lives of these people, right? I mean, I know it's kind of like a middle class dream like everywhere, but like you especially feel it in Tunisia to like go back to the land. You're like, oh my goodness, you just want to like a little plot of land, like you want to be outside of like the urban environment, like you still want to have like like your net, your internet, but like other than that, like you just want to like be able to like kind of like go off the grid with as much as possible. And I know people who've done that, like I mean like who like left Tunis and tried to like get away because. And people still have families. Like there's a lot of like connections outside of the capital. I mean, like when you ask people like where they're from, like no one really believes you if you say you're from the capital, Tunis, because like it's just like it's just sucked like people from around the country to it because there's just like this like history of centralization of like the state capacity in Tunis. That is, I mean, it creates so many problems, but like, you kind of have to deal with it, and people deal with it by like, they'll come to Tunis, they'll make a living there, but like they long to go back and see family in, whatever, rural, place they've come from, or even to, relocate there if possible. So I think there is an element of like, the rural like playing an important role in the Tunisian revolution, which I think there's probably a lot more to like investigate in terms of like the role it did play, but then sort of maybe like getting like co-opted or sidetracked by sort of an urban sort of agenda. But like there's one like a Tunisian academic who sort of made the case that like the only real like let's say, gain of the revolution. And, a lot of people say the only gain is like freedom of speech, but like this one academic was saying, the real like gain of the revolution was this case of Jemna, which is this sort of date growing plantation town where the locals took over land that had been taken from them by the French. And then they tried to take over again after independence, and the state said, no, we're going to manage the land. And then they rented it to people who were close to like the Ben Ali regime later on. Anyway, they took back the land and they said, oh, we're going to start growing for ourselves. We're going to reinvest in the local community. We'll buy an ambulance. We'll invest in a sports field. We'll have basically like like auto development, but like on a sort of like a not necessarily like worker collective basis, because it's actually not just the workers who are benefiting. They're like our whole town should benefit from the one resource we have, and they were like fairly successful in terms of selling more and like producing more than before, but they're still kind of like locked into this macro development problem, which is that Tunisia is stuck in selling, this export-led model, right? Like they're still going to sell their dates to France for like pennies on what like the French consumer is purchasing it for, and then you end up not using land for food. Like you end up like dates are great, but like you also want wheat. Like you need wheat instead of. But like Tunisia buys wheat from like Ukraine and and Russia, and then that's caused like a serious problems, like serious shortages, and like the problem of like the state not being able to like subsidize bread the way it used to, which is really creating some serious issues now. So even though there's like these like a couple like examples where you can say like there's clearly like something going on with the rural shaping the revolution and trying to direct the revolution, it hasn't succeeded, and it hasn't like created sort of an alternative way for Tunisia to go yet.
Yeah, I mean, I guess then the question is like, what are the kind of axes of power in Tunisian state and economy? Like, who are the stakeholders? Like, who's it's easy. I was thinking about this too. Like, say the Syria case, it's easy to just like fixate on Assad family. I mean, yeah, 50 years this family has been around. It's there's a reason why people. That's like a reason why people like say his name and associate it with like the state. Understand that, but like case of Syria, like there's lots of people who are invested in that state behind him, and those like constitute a class of people. And I think that's true for every country. That's true for that. Then the question is though, is that like in our countries, there's a ruling class of people and like a sort of like corporate oligarchy, whatever you want to say, and the politicians change, right? But the class nature of society doesn't. Right. And it seems to be that like this is a global story that isn't just a place. And like, everybody has to take their, I mean, I say this a lot on this show, but like what's expected of you as like a normal country and like a rules-based order is that you take your place in the global supply chain and you shut the fuck up. And in exchange, we won't bomb you and we won't starve you. And a few of your elite kids can come to our stupid schools and like make careers for themselves. That seems to be like one of the sort of like the ways that sort of like avenues of geopolitical force, like sort of like politics works. Geopolitical sort of like formula is just, and seems to be that like being a good citizen of the IMF that Tunisia has been for a long time, same with its neighbors too. With the exception of Libya, but I guess Libya is a different story. Like they want you that you trade away your food sovereignty for, like the quick buck and the not so amazing buck of like the export economy. And then the rule of that country, that has to be a class too, right? That the rich people who own that land pay the poor people to work that land and create the wealth that they live on. All right. And then the person that they sell it to in France makes the lion's share of the profit because they're not doing anything. They just resell it, right, to people who have to like the classes that they rule over in their country. So like this is like how that's like how the international system works. That's how it's supposed to work. So like, what did we like? Is this why we celebrate Tunisia? That like they did the right thing, that like even when they overthrew, because it's not like neoliberalization was like from Ben Ali, right? Like neoliberalization's old in Tunisia. It's been going on for decades. Tunisia has been a good citizen of the IMF since when? Like since forever? Like since before we were born?
Yeah, I mean there was sort of like the Hedi Nouira was like the prime minister who like put forward these sort of liberalization programs, which was really like about like how do you turn Tunisia into like the hub where German and French and Italian manufacturing will be like shipped off to Tunisia, right, for like cheap, right? Like you do, like you pay someone.
Yeah, they want it to be Mexico of NAFTA. Yeah, they want it to be. It's wanted to be the NAFTA.
Exactly,
model, yeah.
Exactly. But like I feel like a lot of the like sort of like particularly with the like the banking and finance selling off of public sector companies, that really accelerated in the 90s under Ben Ali. So like I don't know if that's like a difference between like liberalization versus like neoliberal, or if it's all one continuous process. But like you could definitely say that there's like you could distinguish in terms of stages of where things are going. The sort of point you brought up about like who's really running Tunisia. I mean, it's important to remember like some of these elites are French, right? Like they have French citizenship. Like a lot of like businesses are either registered in France or have their branches of like French businesses. The former prime minister was French. We didn't find that out until like he gave up his like citizenship briefly to run for president, then he lost, and he was given his citizenship back. And so like yeah, no, it's like, I mean, it's kind of a joke because you're like people like look back and they're like, oh my goodness, like our prime minister was French for like several years, and like we had no clue that like we were being governed by literally like a French citizen. I bring this up because it's like not as like any sort of like I know people in Tunisia when they say like, oh, like don't be like people will say like don't be xenophobic, like we should like accept all people, but like
you should be xenophobic. Excuse me, against the French, obviously.
Well, I mean, it's sort of the counter.
Who's saying that? Give me their names.
I mean, I want to give like the counter example of like imagine if in like the U.S. like half the like senators had like Chinese citizenship. Like people would be like, well, this is kind of a problem for like. They'd be like, this is a problem for like being able to like shape like sovereign policy if like if you have a lot of people,
you don't have sovereignty.
Yeah, like it's very clear when you give the counter example. They're like, okay, like there's a problem here, like but like it's become so normalized that people like because there is a like sort of a need to it, right? Like if Tunisians can find a way to like get out and like have a better opportunity in Europe, like people celebrate that, right? I mean, like they know that like it's tough, right? Like if you're stuck in a country where there's going to be like stagnant 20% unemployment, and the cost of living keeps going up, like the dinar keeps devaluing, like if you can go off to Europe and send money back home and become like a European citizen as well, like that's not something like people like are like sad about or mad about. Like it's like if anything, it's like it's a lifeline. Like when you have remittances. Like it's unfortunate like that like the country is so dependent on remittances. Like there needs to be like an entirely different like model. But in the meantime, people have to live, right? Like people have to like be able to like find ways of like making do in like desperate circumstances. So that's where I say like like people like don't want to like they do feel like there's like an issue of talking about people's like second citizenship because like they need it. But in the case of a prime minister, like I think that's like a different issue because you're talking about like people who are in like positions of like actually setting the agenda for where the country's going to go, and you would hope that that's an agenda that's like an independent sovereign one rather than one that's going to be like affected by the fact that you may have to think about like the national interest of other countries. So but I started that because I was thinking about like there is the old sort of aristocracy, right? Like they call them like Beldi, Tunisois, like people who are like the old sort of like Medina elite who have maintained.
Do they have the notables culture that like the Levant does?
Yeah, a little bit like that, right? I mean, like they'll have like these like and.
But do they call them notables? Is that
you'd call them like Beldi, or you'd call them like Tunisois, like you'd say like this sort of like a local aristocracy. But I think liberal Democrats particularly thought that in the post 2011 environment, you had an influx of like new elites, and that was like a good thing from an overall perspective. Like I think that's the theory. That they had like when they see like sort of new players in the game who have like now subsequently been kicked out, right? Like the president has said like parliament's done, we're gonna have this new parliament, which no one really. I mean the turnout was like atrocious for this elections for this new parliament because I think people kind of realized like it's a presidential system. The president has been ruling alone. He's taken all these sort of powers under his own to the presidency, and this parliament is not going to be where things really happen. Things are going to really happen where the president says things are going to happen, right? Like that's how politics is going to get done now. But I don't know, like, I mean, that doesn't mean that, like, people think things are necessarily better, right? Like, that's not better than the previous system, even though there was sort of a lot of like hope in the moment when he was elected, for sure. That this is someone outside of like the politics, who hasn't been in parliament, who hasn't been tainted by this whole sort of like horse trading between like parties. But parties are still very much. It's not like people upset with Kais Saied now and the president and where things are going are like calling for political parties to like come back. Like, people very much are not fans of political parties. Like, there's obviously like a few partisans here and there, but their support bases are still relatively small. And in general, if you ask the average Tunisian, like, are you a fan of political parties, they will say no.
Yeah, well, that's a global phenomenon too. Because you're talking about, what do you think of the political class, and the political class is a reflection, or reflects, depends on how you think of it, like the current, like the sort of the politics of the state, or however the sort of state relates to you, right? Because this is a kind of like, these are the human mechanisms by which these systems work. Because systems are not just, they're not just organic things with human and people making decisions. There's like economic things. There's like cash flows, capital, resources being traded, right? Like all this crazy inputs, you can say, and like the human one being one of them too. So it's interesting. I guess my question is like, what you're describing is neocolonialism, right? The fact that like Tunisia is ruled by, and has this very still, this former colonial ruler over Tunisia, France, is that not the country itself, but it's people who have connections to it, either citizenship or live there, or reside there, which is like the neoliberal term of choice these days. That machinery is still in place. So I guess this is neocolonialism, right? This is not just true for Tunisia. This is like across, not just, I guess across the African continent too, that you do have the entire continent of Africa. You do have that the old colonial powers are still in place, but they've been rebranded, right? And there's been this empowering of this comprador elite, who then take over the reins of power, but are, the most cynical way of saying, just kind of proxies. But the Marxist in us, we can just recognize that as class rule. That class rule is dynamic in nature. You don't need to necessarily have, Paul Bremer sitting in a little weird wrestling like ring with like velvet rope around him as Iraqi soldiers standing behind him. Like that image of the Iraq War is like of the Iraq conquest is so like ingrained in my head of like what colonialism is. Like, it's so naked right there in that moment. But like, you don't need to do that in a place like Tunisia. You have a class of people who like enact the economic relations of colonialism, or at least echo to it, but who take a bigger chunk or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, it's not as extreme, I guess you could say. And this is the theory of neocolonialism, right? So I guess my question is like, did Tunisia ever have independence? Like, was there a moment like that you could say like, because is it true? And then can you really say that about a lot of it's the same question you can ask of a lot of other countries too, is that like, what did this independence era, this so-called like post-colonialism, like question mark, have they left? Is like a phrase that I've always loved, like it's kind of like it's something that we should ask ourselves, like the colonial relations that preceded our current era, supposedly, how much of their ghosts like linger on. So I guess, is that fair to say in the case of Tunisia about its independence?
Yeah, there's always been nationalists, right, who've been like throughout like the period of Tunisian history, who've like in many ways like pushed the terms of Tunisian independence, towards greater sovereignty, right? And whether that was like in the debate between Saleh bin Yusuf and Habib Bourguiba, like initially, where there was sort of this sense that Bourguiba was sort of the one picked by France to manage Tunisia's transition to independence. And that the French would remain in Tunisia, like there would still be French troops in Tunisia. But like, even though Bourguiba and Bourguiba's vision like won out in that moment, with a lot of repression. I mean, there was like, the clear like, repression against Yusufists and Falega, like I mean like the sort of like peasants who had taken up arms and who had driven some of the national liberation struggle. It took several years before, for example, the French base in Bizerte was basically they were forced out as well. Like they had to leave because there was just too much pressure to have this base here, the troops there, which is just I remember hearing like a family member sort of telling me about how like they were activists for independence in like post-independence Tunisia, right? Like they were sort of like, and he was like a teacher. He was talking about like they were like missionaries who were enjoying local privileges which they didn't like, and they were like basically calling on the Bourguiba regime to like, revoke these privileges of these French citizens who were still living in their town as kind of like, almost like colonizers, right? Like they felt like there was still colonization continuing in what was post, nominally independent Tunisia. So I think like there was still like this process of like nationalists within the country trying to assert more and more sovereignty over those years. And even under like the Ben Ali regime, like the RCD was like a wide tent. It was an extremely repressive, organ that like for the most part was like let's say like friendly to like foreign capital, to France, to domestic capitalists. But there were also nationalists within RCD who wanted to try and carve out as much space as they could, sometimes like in very like unseen ways or in very sort of like discreet ways, for there to be like maneuverability for domestic policy making that's not necessarily like shaped by foreign interests. So I think and outside of the RCD, like the unions, I mean like the unions have always had people within them, maybe not necessarily at the leadership level at the very top, but like certainly at different regional levels, who have very much seen, I mean, the union as a national liberation tool, right? It predates liberation. I mean, it's one of those things where like, I think there's a lot of countries where like the main like labor unions don't have such a powerful national liberation history as they do in Tunisia. So yeah, I think all of these are sort of like, the question, has Tunisia ever been independent? Like, it's always like, I feel like it's always like a scale. It's like, where is the fight, like currently? Like, are there people within the system who are able to sort of say, like, Tunisia's moving toward, we're gonna find ways of creating more space for independence, or not? And some of that also includes, like I said, like balancing different like foreign interests. And Tunisia's been, it's kind of had to, given the fact that it's such a small country, like find ways of playing off, in foreign interference against each other.
Yeah, and then you still have, and I mean, in some ways, like Tunisia is like not exceptional in the context of like another struggle that's like common in the region, which is between Islamists and secularists too, right? Like this is kind of like this is a sort of this is a pan-Islamic sort of country question that like is negotiated. And I guess it's also true for non-Islamic countries too. Like, what do you do with, say, religious conservatives in your country who have a different model of sovereignty, different model of, social education, different, like the things that you fight over, that people fight over in the way they do, that like suburban people here fight over, oh, I don't want this in my schools. Like these are like, I mean, of course, like those are two different things, but in the sense that like in a lot of different countries, and like, say, for instance, Egypt, right? You're like your next door neighbor, or like, your neighbor, like that's the fear of the Islamist rule, like is this sort of one of the central like through lines of the Egyptian state, and also the military, which is, overlapping, to put it mildly, like that, to say that like fear of Islamists or like the reactionary stance to Islamism is a kind of like running thread. In Tunisia, it doesn't seem to be the case, like at least, or it doesn't, like the sort of Islamist secularist question doesn't, and maybe I'm wrong. Is that fair?
There is definitely, I think it's strong. Like, I think like the Islamist secular divide has been a big driver of things. Like, maybe not to the extent that it has been in Egypt, but it's in the sense of like, in 2013, when there was sort of the coup in Egypt, there was this big concern that like it would happen in Tunisia. And then some people were calling for it. Some people were saying like, we want to see what happened in Egypt happen in Tunisia. We want to get rid of like the Islamists. And the Islamists themselves were saying, we are concerned that, there's going to be a coup against us. And that's partly why they entered into negotiations and this sort of like backroom wheeling dealing with the sort of quartet, which was sort of civil society groups, including the union most prominently, that basically negotiated a semi-step down of power from the Islamists at that moment. There were new elections. They went into coalition with the winners, who said that they're never going to coalition with them, which was sort of like, that was sort of the weird thing that happened, is like the secularists or not secularists. I mean, they're really not like secular in any way, in the sense of like, maybe they are, but they're not sort of like, the people who call themselves secularists in Tunisia are not immune to like using like religious rhetoric in ways that are like even less, like even more like reactionary sometimes than the public rhetoric of Islamists. But they present themselves basically as secularists. What they really are is like anti-Islamists. And there's like a through line of like in Algeria, they were called the eradicationists, and there's definitely eradicationists, like people who say like, we want to like excise Islamists from Tunisian society. And I think like a lot of those people are like very supportive, have been very supportive of Kais Saied, for example. Like they think that like the best thing that he's done is like basically cut the Ennahda party, the Islamist party, out of politics. There was like an element of that under Ben Ali as well, but then there was also like, quite a lot of sort of negotiation, right? Like negotiation between like Ben Ali and the Islamists. So, for better, I think Tunisia hasn't seen like eradicationism as a philosophy like really like take hold the way it has in Algeria, where I think the violence there was I mean, it's you want, I think that kind of violence wasn't like violence that like in any way was like necessarily like beneficial in the long term for the state, right? I mean, it was like, brothers killing brothers, civil war is like something that I think everyone wants to avoid. So luckily, like I think like that eradicationist like trend, even though it's like virulent, it's still a minority, and I think there's like many people, many elements, many constituencies that are good at sort of like maybe using it to drum up support, or using it to sort of like for short-term political gain, but then like put a break on it before it gets to a point where this is going to like really destroy the fabric of society. So it hasn't gotten to there yet, but it really is like, I would say like it has been at crucial moments like a driving factor of like sort of like how politics is done in Tunisia. And that said, like I also think like it's important to note that like the Islamists in Tunisia have often been seen as like in the West as like, oh, these are like the real like Democrats, like we need to support them 100%. And like they have a history of having been used like and supported as a counter to leftists and to communists, to Marxists of all stripes. Against the union even sometimes. They have like like the student union, for example, has like a countervalent, like an opposing like Islamist student union. Like there's two student unions, like the old school student union, and then there's the like Islamist student union, and one is UGET and one is UGTE, and they're like it's like very different. Like they're like little mirrors of each other, but like that like fight between like student union and stuff, the Islamist variety versus the Islamist versus the non-Islamist, like even under Ben Ali's era, like there was like serious contestation between the two. So like you wouldn't see like contestation like out in the open under like a Ben Ali regime, but like if you do see it happening, it's like if you pay attention and if you're there and if you see like people within this part of society like sort of like battling it out. So like I think it is a through line, and it's good to remember that actually while the West like a lot of people in the West look at like Ennahda as like, you know, the real like liberal Democrats, the real representatives of Tunisia, like, you know, in many ways. You know, they really are liberals. I mean, and I think that's sort of like the important to consider, like from an economic perspective as well. Like I think like people like really read it as like liberalism in terms of like just their like political stances and like not being necessarily reactionary or not necessarily being like, you know, allowing like fundamentalism to sort of like make them sort of like take very like polarized positions that are going to like, you know, in many ways like be a wrecking ball to society, or like really like a wild card in society. But like to consider like, oh, they are very much in support of like the liberalization project, which in many ways has now, I think, been rejected. Like it's not just rejection of like the Islamists as like, you know, from a religious ideological perspective that we're seeing in the last few years. We're seeing the rejection on like, you have really failed economically, right? Like this liberalism that you have introduced or allowed to continue like on autopilot has really in many ways like wrecked a lot of the sort of like social indicators that, you know, people expect and feel like they need.
So this is the unfair question that I always ask the regional expert guy, but I put like what happens next in all of this, like to get past this impasse, like how do some, I mean, like, I'm not sure what happens next, but what can happen next? Like, can there be a few different scenarios from here, or is it just the grinding sounds of neoliberal hell just go on, and it's just kind of like, oh, this guy's here now, like everywhere else?
Yeah, you know, like a lot of people. I mean, that's such a difficult question because I think the avenues for change or for people getting involved in politics, right? People finding some way of like shaping their government according to what they want and what they need, have shrunk, right? In many ways. Like when you have like power concentrated within the presidency, like unfortunately what that means is also the president, because he doesn't have a political party, he doesn't have like a real grassroots base, he has some networks that are supporting them, but like they're not in any way sort of organized in traditional ways. And so he's mainly relied on the police and the military. And the police especially has been, you know, I mean, they kind of like do things the way they've always done, which is, you know, they are a police state. They are a repressive organ. They're not there like finding like real solutions for social economic problems. They're there to like beat people down when they get upset about social economic problems. And they're there to sort of like, you know, assert their own power and in many ways like take revenge on people who challenge that, whether that's like journalists or even in like now we're starting to see like even unionists, right? Like are starting to feel some of the pain from the police unions, judges, of course, some lawyers. So you know, the fact that like that you really see the executive branch being empowered in this way, in particular like the police, is not like, I think, conducive to sort of like people power, right? Like I mean, but you know, what is the alternative? I mean, there really isn't to this moment like a political party, a grouping, an institution, any sort of like movement or mobilization that is offering any sort of you know, let's say like not just like a democratic alternative, but like a socially rooted alternative, like one that people can like get behind. Like, and so like what you see is like you see people from abroad basically saying like, you know, anyone but like the current president. I was like, okay, well, what are you gonna do? Like, you know, how do you do that? Like,
I always love that. They're like, oh, anyone but so and so. It's like, oh, so ISIS? So you said ISIS is okay? You said anyone, right? Does that count ISIS? Like, do you mean like actual head chopping freaks? You don't actually mean that. So like, be careful. It's like that's because people like say that stuff all the time, especially when you don't live in a country. But like, you're calling for violence. You're calling for like a violent overthrow of maybe just one person. In your head, you're saying that, but like. This guy Saeed is like a figure. I mean, not figurehead, but like any president who, you know, is in his position, especially how it's evolved to be so concentrated. It's like this is a proxy of a class rule and the like performative layers that states put on, right? The sort of like onions that the skin of the onion that they add on to like to show legitimacy or perform legitimacy or to earn it. I don't know. Maybe it's how they earn it. Like they add on layers of like, okay, this class of people is tasked with the political side. This class of people is the education side. Like, you know what I mean? And you incorporate them into the running of your state. And so the fact that it's just so nakedly like, it's so like it kind of reminds me of the Shah. Like it kind of reminds me of like the last Shah. Like he just was like, okay, I'm the sovereign, bro. Like we're gonna do some violent top down like forced modernization. But like this guy is like, we're not like the mode of neoliberalism we're in now doesn't allow for that kind of like, you know, that like the white revolution supposedly in Iran, so called, right? Like you can't do that kind of stuff because we have this thing called the IMF, and the IMF like rules over countries like in like Tunisia, that like they're part of that machinery. And so like you don't have the economic sovereignty required to like, and then you also don't have like, you know, something like say oil, right? In the case of Tunisia, you don't have something like oil because oil is a license to print money, right? It's like this like the extractivist nature of like modern states. Ooh, what's that? Ooh, what happened? Decide to shahid itself. It's Tunisian mukhabarat. They're listening. Just kidding. We're talking about something else. Irony. Like I don't know. I guess my question is like, how long can you maintain this class rule? I mean, I guess it's been maintaining for a while. And if you don't need the performative thing of like having a large party or a parliament and like sustaining that kind of theater of like political interaction and like political change, which is like so much of like what happens in democracies. So it sounds to me like Tunisia is doing just fine on the democracy front. This is how democracies work. It's just a little bit nakeder in the case of the case of Tunisia in terms of like, well, there's a certain class of people running the country and they like have.
Well, I mean, the thing is, the president like has like very strong opinions about like political system. Like he wants a political system that's like, I mean, he's introduced not like he's introduced a second chamber of parliament, right? So now there's not just like a parliament, which like, you know, political parties are like almost like prevented from like being able to run in this part. They didn't want to run in this parliament anyway. They think it's illegitimate. But like so you have this parliament which doesn't really have the power to check the president. They're supposed to like basically like sometimes propose some laws. You know, we'll see how that goes. I mean, they didn't even manage to fill all the seats in parliament because there weren't people like running for certain seats. And then there were some who were like running uncontested. So it's like people are not like really saying like parliament's not going to be the place where like this is going to be like the generator of like new ideas. Like I don't think people believe that this is like a legitimate institution. But he wants like a second chamber of parliament, which is going to be like this sort of like reversed pyramid of like you know, the regions will be the ones in charge, and then they'll like send someone who's to a higher regional council who will then have someone to this you know, representative body, and they're so. But it's like, I mean, he's a constitutional law professor, so he kind of like loves this stuff. Like the president like has been like, this is like he's kind of like enacting his dreams of like, you know, like of like, you know, I guess
Plato. It's like Platonic ideals.
Yeah. So I mean, like
Yeah.
in the meantime, like you actually have to like, you know, find a way to like make sure that like Tunisia's credit rating doesn't like, you know, continue like, you know, falling through the floor. And like, you know, like way forward, like I mean, like what happens next? I mean, like I think like on finance, like an IMF, like that's extremely crucial. Like finding an alternative to the IMF, actually taking the steps to have an alternative to IMF financing, because I mean, since Tunisia started taking IMF financing in 2013, like its debt to GDP ratio has just skyrocketed, right? I mean, this is like now a debt cycle.
That's exactly where they want you. That's the gangster economics. They want you in their debt, and they know how to squeeze you, and interest. Like it wins for them every time, these loans.
So I mean, but there's actually like a really like good it's called the Tunisian Observatory for Economy that has now started a series on the IMF, and like saying like, guys, we all know like we need to like not have the IMF involved. Like the question now is like, how do we actually do that? Like what are the alternative like financing mechanisms? Exactly.
China.
I mean, like not just China, but also like just like there's a lot of like examples in Asia that have not been sort of like you know, from I don't quite understand bilateral swap agreements, but that's kind of like one of the things that they're talking about is like in Asia, this is like an alternative financing mechanism that like, Tunisia should at least like use all of the tools at its disposal, and it's not really using all of its tools at its disposal right now for alternative financing. And then the other thing is like on agriculture, like there needs to be a serious change on agriculture because, we have a story coming out in Meshkal.org soon about like olive farming and the way that like for example like basically like these big families so that have a lot of land have all like turned to intensive farming and expanded intensive farming, like really water intensive,
like monocropping.
Monocropping for a long time, but like, even more intense than before, and especially like really water intensive. Just like trying to get like tiny little bits of like the European market where you're selling in bulk and then they like rebrand it. So like if you buy like olive oil in like in the US or Canada, like if it says it's Italian, it's probably Tunisian. Like they just it's just that the Italian
like all good Italian things, it's actually Tunisian.
Well, I'm gonna get in trouble for that. But so like we talked to this guy who's like, basically like, a capitalist who's like, got this like giant farm, and he's like in Cairo, which is like they have groundwater, but like the groundwater literally just is like plummeting every year because like these giant farms are like using it, and then small farmers like have no access to water, and they don't like, and so like the government is starting to realize, they're like, okay, we have a problem with wheat. Like we just don't grow enough food. Like we are dependent on importing food, and we need a way to find the way to like get around this. Like even like IMF, World Bank are saying like, Tunisia needs to find a way to get more wheat. And so their solution has been, well, we'll just offer more money to farmers to grow more wheat. Like, okay, well, you did that, and then farmers actually grew even less wheat when you did that. And why is that? It's because they know that the entire architecture of the state is geared towards like basically helping out these big capitalists who are selling olives to Europe, right? Like they get all of like the loans, they get all of the technical assistance, they get all of the water. So there are like movements in Tunisia, like small, like oftentimes like decentralized, like happening outside of Tunis, where people are saying like, let's have land, especially like at least let's start with like state-owned land, and let's have that go back to farmers. Like if people can have like a plot of land and work the land and use it for like either like self-sustaining or even to like maybe like a social project like the Jemna example I told you earlier, like that's at least a start. Like I think they're called like Farmers Without Land is one of the groups that we're looking at recently. So like I think like those two like are really important. Like you need to find a way to like deal with like the agriculture question, and you need to deal with like the finance question. Like those are to me like the most pressing if you like want to see any sort of improvement on like all the other factors